Thanks, Dr. Howery. Let me start with Mr. Lausch. We were together on July 22nd when Attorney General Garland came to the city of Chicago. We were with the mayor and made some important stops that day. It was for the announcement of the Chicago Strike Force, and I thank you for your leadership in that regard. The urgency of the problem that we face has been repeated over and over again. Let me ask you a very basic thing. After the announcement of the creation of this task force, did you see an input of any new resources, of money coming to your office, ability to hire additional people for this purpose?
At the time, Senator, there was not an additional input of resources for money or new AUSAs or things like that. What did happen, which was incredibly important, was whenever the Department of Justice prioritizes something like firearms trafficking, United States attorneys across the country realize that it is a way they need to mobilize the resources they have towards that particular area. And so our office had already focused on firearms trafficking, but we added more resources, more people to focus on cases like that. And around the country, it was the same thing. We really overall kind of enhanced our efforts to really prioritize those cases.
But it's a zero-sum situation, is it not? You had to take those resources from something else that you were spending them on.
That's what happens, you know, any time you're a prosecutor. You're always prioritizing based upon not only what an initiative that might come up, but what you see on the ground. I mean, to give you another example, when the carjackings increased significantly in Chicago over the last couple of years, we've spent more time doing carjacking cases than we had before as well. So we're addressing the particular issues that we see in front of us. So.
Well, I certainly hope that we can improve that situation for you at the federal level by sending the additional resources that might make a difference. We read about the RICO and Vicar actions that are being taken against individuals to try to break up these gangs. That seems to me to be a pretty labor-intensive effort, is it not, among the attorneys?
It is. It's a very labor-intensive effort, but it's an impactful one. And just to provide one quick example, one of the cases that Special Agent in Charge Detinio mentioned was a recent case we charged, and I won't get too far into the details. 13 individuals were charged. We alleged 19 murders, 19 attempted murders in that particular case. This just came out recently. We are already hearing feedback from our local law enforcement partners that is having a positive impact in the community. Members of the community see that we are doing something to hold people accountable for murders, and also it is having a deterrent effect of people not wanting to be the next person to get charged federally. So it is resource intensive. It is something we keep our eye on all the time, but it's important that we do organizational cases like that.
It's my understanding that over the years, the structure of gangs in Chicago has changed. There was a time when there were 3 or 4 headliners, overlords. Many of them were arrested and imprisoned. But now I'm told that it's been dispersed. There could be a gang that just has a square block that they consider their own territory. Doesn't that make it difficult to use RICO and Vicar to disperse the gangs if they are proliferating?
So twofold on your initial premise. That's certainly a fair statement, and I've seen the same thing, Mr. Chairman. We've seen the gangs, you know, the large nation gangs broken down by factions. That's certainly something we've seen. But what we've also seen with that is we've seen more violence that's based not necessarily on protecting a drug corner, for instance. We've seen more violence based upon, you know, internal disputes, more violence based upon social media, back and forth, and retaliation. And in that situation, we've used VICAR in particular, which is violent crime in aid of racketeering, in order to charge individuals even for one particular murder, if it is in furtherance of their racketeering activity. And so those are still important tools to use even with smaller groups. So your point is a fair one, but that tool can still be effective in trying to disrupt the violence of those types of groups.
Let's address straw purchasing for a moment. As I mentioned earlier, my wife and I went down to Rita High School. There were blocks and blocks of law enforcement officials coming to pay their respects to Ella French. It was a moving moment. You just sensed that there was deep feelings about what happened to that wonderful young police officer who lost her life in service to us. Straw purchasing generated the gun that killed her. It seems to me that that still haunts us in terms of gun stores and gun dealers who are willing to look the other way when someone is obviously buying guns they can't personally use, either by the nature of the gun or the volume of the purchase. I'm told that many times the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't prosecute these crimes because the penalties are so low, and they're just taken as bookkeeping violations. Explain to me your attitude toward that and what you've done about it.
Certainly, we, in our office and in other offices across the country, I mean, we view straw purchasing as a serious crime. There are challenges sometimes to being able to prove those cases. Oftentimes, straw purchasing, I mean, it is making a false statement on a form that, you know, at a federal firearms licensee. But when we are able to prove those cases, you know, prove someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, we charge them. And it's important that we charge them in order to show, you know, potential straw purchasers that they will end up with a felony conviction for buying a gun, even if it's for a loved one. But if it's a loved one who has a felony conviction, they should not be receiving that gun. We, you know, ATF works hard. We work hard on identifying the types of cases that we think we'll be able to prosecute and make an impact.
Can you produce some numbers to show prosecutions for straw purchases and what's happened to them over the years that you've been in this office?
So I don't have numbers with me here today. You know, Senator Durbin would be happy to look further into that. I would point you to the press release that I mentioned that we put out twice a year for the last several years since I've been the U.S. Attorney. We do identify the straw purchasing cases that we do in those circumstances.
If I wanted to legally purchase a gun in Indiana, Northwest Indiana, from a gun dealer, do you know what I'm required to do?
So I don't know specifically what you would be required to do. I know in Illinois you would need a FOID card in order to purchase that firearm. In other states, they have their own specific things that they would need to do. One thing for sure, if you were a felon, you would not be able to purchase that gun legally in the state of Indiana.
Let me ask Mr. Tinio, can you tell me what I'm legally required to do if I'm a resident of Illinois? Let's assume I have a FOID card, and I want to go to Indiana to purchase a gun because they have a lower sales tax on firearms. What do I have to do?
So, Chairman, that's a good question in that the federal laws require you to be a resident of the state in which you are purchasing the firearm. There are certain ways to do it where you can purchase it in Indiana and have it shipped to a licensed dealer in Illinois. If you're an Illinois resident, you would still need the FOID card. But if you're asking if you as an Illinois resident can just go to an Indiana gun store and say, I'd like to buy a firearm, you cannot do that. You need to be a resident of the state in which the FFL is located unless you are having it shipped to an FFL in your state.
So I can't understand why we have a problem. If persons from Illinois can't purchase guns in Indiana except going through this bureaucracy, what's the problem?
So, a challenging question for sure. So in your question, what I was getting at is if you are a resident to purchase from an FFL, you can do that. In my testimony, you cannot do that. In my testimony, I mentioned unlicensed dealing as a definite diverter of legal firearms. So in which case, it doesn't matter. You as an Illinois resident can then go buy a gun from anybody who's willing to sell it to you who does not have a license.
Doesn't have to be a gun show either, does it?
No, it does not.
So it seems to me that this is a fiction we have created, that somehow this Illinois resident is going to go get a FOID card, do a background check, go to an Indiana dealer, purchase a firearm, then have the firearm transferred by that dealer to an Illinois dealer where I would take possession. How often does that happen?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. If you're talking about how often do the firearms show up in crimes, it's not because they were transferred from an Indiana dealer to an Illinois dealer.
What percentage of firearms do you know are responsible for gun crimes in Illinois that originate in Indiana?
I don't have the exact number. Illinois, like most states in the country, is its greatest source of firearms. It makes a lot of sense in terms of geography. In relation to Chicago, we have the western suburbs. We also have Indiana, also very much in close proximity. But Illinois does remain the #1 source of firearms for Chicago.
According to ATF records in fiscal year 2020, the ATF Chicago Field Division conducted 86 firearms compliance inspections of federally licensed gun dealers. Of those 86 inspections, 45 federally licensed gun dealers had no violations, 41 found violations of firearm laws or regulations. Can you tell me if that was a regular year, an exceptionally large number of inspections, or otherwise?
So calendar year 2020 was challenging throughout the entire country, and differing COVID restrictions, differing issues with personnel due to illness, and things like that have made 2020 a difficult year to look at in terms of numbers. What I can say for sure is that in this year, we have hired additional industry operations investigators. We have built an additional industry operations group in the Chicagoland area and have made some significant changes to our management of our industry operations program in the field division.
According to ATF data, other field divisions conducted significantly more gun dealer inspections in that same year, fiscal year 2020. For example, the Kansas City and Dallas field divisions each conducted over 850 inspections. We did 86. Why the difference?
So I think there's a number of reasons that could give a difference to that. I spend my time focused on our field division and what is most impactful to us. There are a number of reasons why there could be differences, including COVID restrictions in the areas, including staffing, including just overall numbers of dealers. It's important to note that Chicago itself is a humongous portion of our field division, and there are no federally licensed firearms dealers within Chicago.
But 10 times the number of inspections in Kansas City and Dallas?
And Senator Durbin, I think what is very important in this is to note crime gun intelligence, and we are excited to see that some of our other field divisions are able to conduct a number of inspections like that, so that when we have firearms flowing to us from somewhere else, we do have the resources there to look at those dealers. Those numbers don't necessarily encapsulate everything. If an inspection takes a much longer period of time, a dealer that has a humongous inventory, it takes a much greater amount of time to conduct an inspection than it does in a smaller dealer with fewer items in inventory.
Still, 10 times as many inspections. Let me speak to you about ghost guns. In 2016, there were 2 ghost guns that were recovered in Chicago. In 2020, there were 139. Last year, you told me, when we met in October, you told me that this year, out of 10,000 crime guns recovered by the CPD, 375 were ghost guns. So from 2 in 2016 to 139 in 2020 to 375 this calendar year so far. Maybe more now. Is this a trend we should be worried about?
I think it's a trend that we should absolutely keep our eyes on. The name ghost gun is not a scientific or term for it, but we use it because of the lack of traceability. So it is a very important trend for us to keep our eye on.
Tell me if I'm describing this correctly. These people order over the internet the component parts of a gun that don't have any serial number identification on them. Then they assemble them and use them as you would an ordinary gun. Is that correct?
Yes. So we use the term ghost gun to apply to a privately made firearm, so that by its nature is not required to have a serial number if it's kept for personal use.
I find it hard to believe that ATF's regulatory definition of a firearm does not include unfinished frames and receivers that can be easily converted into operable firearms with ghost gun assembly kits. Have you heard anything within the agency about responding to that deficiency?
I know that currently there is a NPRM, a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, being undertaken by ATF and the department, but that is not something that I have any expertise in.
We're going to take a look at that in Washington. Mr. Lausch, what specific steps is the U.S. Attorney's Office taking in conjunction with local law enforcement to combat carjackings?
So over time, we have had particular task forces that have worked with the Chicago Police Department, and we've had FBI specifically and ATF working with Chicago Police Department to identify patterns of carjackings, and ultimately when there is an individual who's arrested, for us to look at those cases to determine whether or not we can charge that person federally. If there is a string of carjackings, can we charge a conspiracy to commit carjackings and things like that. But it has been a significant focus of ours and our federal law enforcement partners for some time now.
I noticed that Sheriff Dart made an appeal to the automobile manufacturers to do something to help. Are you aware of anything that they are considering or might be doing?
I'm not aware of Sheriff Dart's outreach to them or anything in particular.
I'm just wondering if I'm told there's more technology in our cars than we know, and it could be that there is something they could do where we could trace these cars, their whereabouts after the carjacking.
I can't speak to the car manufacturers, what they're doing or not doing. What I can tell you is that we use all the tools that we can, both federally and in state law enforcement when there is a carjacking, gathering evidence through things like navigation devices and things like that in cars in order to determine whether or not we can, follow the vehicles and ultimately, get enough evidence to charge people for them.
Mr. Tenio, I'd like to have you address the issue of thefts from gun dealers. Thousands of guns are stolen each year from these gun dealers. One of the measures that I've introduced with Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois, called the Secure Firearms Storage Act, would require gun dealers to secure their inventory after business hours to decrease these thefts. How important is this issue?
So there are a number of ways that guns are diverted from legal commerce, and one of those is by theft. We in the Chicago Field Division and throughout ATF respond to every single theft that's reported from an FFL because we do believe that every one of those guns is destined to be part of a crime. So it is very important. We do a lot of outreach in conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and one of the topics that we do discuss with FFLs is encouraging securing their inventory, maintaining positive control of their inventory.
So when you do the inspections, is that one of the things you look for?
It's not one of our regulations, but it is something that we discuss with them when we do our inspections. Because
that seems so basic. We know that smash and grab gun up in Wisconsin ended up in, 27 different shootings before we finally took it out of circulation. And we have thousands of guns each year, as you mentioned, stolen and likely to be involved in crime. I don't know, I think Congress has an important responsibility here that we haven't reached, and we should. Tell me about NIBIN. Is the strike force effectively using NIBIN to assist trafficking investigations?
Yes, in my testimony I spoke about tracing and NIBIN both. They're both critical components to us allocating our resources and identifying traffickers. So NIBIN is the ballistics evidence matching, and we use that really to shorten our time to crime. So the moment that we know the gun was purchased to the time that it's used in a crime and its recovery by law enforcement.
I went on a personal crusade to try to get police departments across Illinois, every one of them, to do crime gun tracing so that we can at least figure out what's happening to these guns, how they're moving around. And is the strike force ensuring that ATF's E-Trace system is being used in these trafficking investigations?
Yes, all of our Chicago Field Division spends time with our departments explaining the importance of comprehensive tracing to all of them.
As I understand, tracing in our state is done through the state police.
So tracing is done by ATF. Illinois State Police does trace their firearms through us, as do most of the other agencies in the area.
So what percentage of law enforcement agencies do you think are sending this information in to the state police or to you?
I wish that I knew the exact percentage of it. I know that we have a lot of data that we are able to use to focus our efforts every day.
What message would you send to those police departments who don't take the time to report these crime guns for tracing?
I would do the same thing that I've done today at your pleasure, to speak to them the importance of knowing the history of a gun and how it enhances efforts to stop violent crime in their community.
Thank you. Dr. Oury, it's been quite a few years ago that I went to the juvenile facility in Cook County here, and these were teenagers, adolescents, waiting for trial, sometimes waiting as long as 2 years. And within the building, the juvenile facility, There's a high school with classrooms and a cafeteria and a gym, and it looks like a regular high school. Of course, the students are confined to the premises there. But I sat down with the counselors to these students and said, who are these kids? How do they end up being shooters or being involved in gangs that are killing people? And they said, almost every mental illness that you can imagine, we find here. But there's one recurring theme. Over 90% of them were victims or witnesses of trauma, and it changed their lives. You said as much in your testimony. You also said that it's preventable, violence is preventable. The question I need to ask you, and I want on the record here, is trauma treatable?
Well, thank you for that question. Trauma is treatable, it's also preventable. And when I look at what we can do from CDC and with communities, it's really having many different strategies to prevent that trauma from happening in the first place. So programs in schools that teach youth how to mediate conflict, job training programs, hospital-based interventions like the HEAL initiative, really working in communities around community greening and connectedness. That all provides the protective factors. To treat trauma, there's things like trauma-informed care and making sure people get linked to the resources they need so that they don't continue to experience that trauma. But preventing trauma is something that we're very committed to.
And so when you look at the issue of trauma and consider where we are today, we know that because of COVID-19 and the interruption of regular school attendance, that several things have happened. One of them, sadly, was an increase in domestic violence. And one of the ACEs, the adverse childhood experience, is being involved in domestic violence or witnessing domestic violence. A boyfriend or a husband beats up your mother in your presence, and you see it as a child. And it has an impact on you, as it would, that kind of situation. We also realize that many of these young people are not getting even the most basic counseling day in and day out because they're separated from the classroom and the teacher. Not that every teacher is a good counselor, but many of them are, and that's lacking as well. So we have these kids now trickling back to school, in and out because of COVID. And we're being warned by national experts that there's a greater incidence of mental health issues. Would you reflect on that for a moment?
Sure, and I think, when we look at homicides, mental health plays a very small role in it. The majority of perpetrators of homicide are not mentally ill. With COVID, we certainly have seen an increase in mental health distress. We have not seen an increase in suicide deaths. My concern is because of many of the risk factors that you raise, we might see an increase in suicide deaths at a later date because of economic issues, this social isolation, disruption to daily routine. When we reflect on what can we do now, given these changes due to COVID, we've actually seen a lot of innovation, and I'm one of those optimists that believe there's a lot we can do. We've seen in South Carolina virtual programs to target ACEs, to where families are brought together through strengthening families. I saw in Colorado they did virtual mentoring programs for youth to have that connectedness. I have a 12-year-old. She's much more savvy at technology than I am, and during the pandemic was able to have probably more playdates and connectedness than pre-pandemic. So I think really tapping into how do we strengthen those protective factors of connectedness, communities that care, and really looking at how can you, if it's not that parent, maybe it's that teacher, maybe it's that neighbor that you can have that mentoring relationship with, and look for opportunities for additional education or training, even remote. So I do believe that a lot of these protective factors will mitigate what we've seen with COVID.
Years ago, I attended a grade school, Chicago Public Grade School, and they were using meditation as part,
Yes.
calm classrooms, they called it. And they asked me to sit quietly, which is a challenge for a politician, to sit quietly for 10 minutes while the kids were at their tables and desks and had meditation in the morning. And so I tried, I think I pulled it off pretty well. But I noticed that in that classroom, in that quiet classroom, there was one little boy who was not doing well. He was fidgeting and looking around and clearly was not happy with this challenge. I went to the teacher after the class and said, I'm guessing the little boy in the checkered shirt there has an issue. She said, yes. And it came down to trauma issue, some things that were going on in his home. And I said to her, so what do you do as a teacher of that boy? She said, I'm a teacher. I teach math. I'm not a psychologist or a counselor. I've got to find someone that I can bring in for this little boy. And that struck me as one of the real challenges. We need more and more people who are involved in social work and mental health counseling to intervene and treat those who are apparently victims of trauma. What is your response to that from the CDC perspective?
So I think certainly trauma-informed care is really important, and I think there can be a lot of training done for teachers. And in the emergency department, we had to use trauma-informed care because many patients would come in and might not be happy to see me after a trauma, and seeing me in the emergency department could re-traumatize them. So knowing how to approach a patient in a caring, non-judgmental way, same thing for teachers in schools. Not assuming that that child is wearing the same clothes from yesterday or didn't complete their homework because they're lazy. You don't know what's going on in their house, and to approach them with compassion, refer them to resources when appropriate. Certainly we need more. I think COVID has really shown a light that we need more on prevention and public health and treatment. And I think going back to prevention, if we can have these programs in schools that focus on strengthening families, building skills so that kids have what they need to cope, that can even lessen additional trauma they might face at a future date.
Thank you, Dr. Ari, and thanks to this panel. We're going to be back in touch with you formally and informally, perhaps some written questions, but more importantly on an informal basis to see what we're doing. I mean, the fact that so many of my House colleagues came, and there are other elected officials in the room who were invited to witness this as well, tells you that this is something you hear about every day and we hear about every day. And people are expecting us to be mindful of the challenge that we face and do something about it, not just hold a hearing, but actually do something. I'm hoping we can do that. I hope the Resources and Reconciliation will help us put money into violence intervention. I'm hoping to find resources, Mr. Lausch, to help you on the prosecutorial side as well as the police side of this equation as well. I would be remiss if I didn't mention this as well. We are also living in a period of time when justice and equality is being openly discussed as it should be in this country. We know George Floyd's situation, Laquan McDonald, we know all of those instances. I've spoken to police, members of the police force around our state in private and confidential settings. I've never heard anybody try to explain away those situations. They understand that this was a gross departure from what is expected of people in law enforcement. We have got to combine ways of effectively reducing crime with ways of increasing the relationship and communication between members of our community and law enforcement. We've got to try to bring trust into this equation. It's not easy. I think we all understand it's part of our responsibility as well. But thank you so much. Is there any closing comment that anyone would like to make on